In Letcher County, Kentucky, Claib Jones has been lost to the sands of time. Ask anyone from there, and they can tell you that they have heard of Banjo Wright, Todd Hall, Henry Adams, Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor, or Bad Ira Mullins. But few, if any, have ever heard of Claib Jones. While researching the story of Todd Hall, the name of Claib Jones took a prominent role in many of the feuds of the area. And I was even more shocked to learn that he was a member of the Union Army during the Civil War. As we go through the story of Claib, some of the feuds and events that we covered in the Todd Hall story will sound familiar. However, these events will be told from the side of Claib and what parts he played in Letcher County, Kentucky history. We will be using his own words from his autobiography published by the Hazard Book Company from Hazard, Kentucky. This story will be broken up into three parts: his pre-war life, his time in the Union Army, and finally his time as a major player in the feuds of Kentucky. All aboard the Kentucky-Tennessee Living Time Machine. Please fasten your seat belts and keep your arms and legs inside the vehicle at all times. But to get going, we need your help. We still need to fire up the time machine to transport us. Please help us by clicking on the like, subscribe, and bell notification buttons down below. Not only does this fire up the time machine, but it convinces YouTube that we need a bigger time machine to reach more people who love history as much as you do. Now, back to our story. Who was Claib Jones? John Jones was born in Hawkins County, Tennessee. When he was 20 years old, he moved to Floyd County, Kentucky. There he met and married Rebecca Arnold, who was born in Tazewell, Tennessee. On February 14, 1826, John Jones and Rebecca Arnold Jones welcomed their son, James Claiborne Claib Jones. He was born at Arnold Fork, which is a branch of Beaver Creek. Shortly after his birth, they moved 15 miles away to a small area which John Jones named after himself and called it Jones Fork. Claib would go on to marry three women, an Epperson woman, Matilda Fisher, and Christina Holbrook Jones. Claib would have 5 children: Rebecca Elizabeth Jones Klein Bryant, Dora Jones Atkins, Charles Aaron Jones, Phoebe Myrtle Jones Luttrell, and Hiram Francis Jones. He would also have a string of ladies as girlfriends throughout his lifetime. Rebecca and John split. After several years of being together, Rebecca decided to end the relationship she had with John. The reason given was that John loved the company of ladies. This story is summarized from the telling that Claib gives about the events surrounding their breakup in his book. Jones says that this event molded the rest of his life and how he had a dim look upon marriage and staying with his wives. Evidently, when he was 8 years old, Claib was visiting his father, who took Claib with him to visit one of his girlfriends, who was married by the name of Catherine Smith. According to Claib, Catherine was mean to him, and so he told his mother, Rebecca, what had happened. During John Hay's house raising, Rebecca armed herself with clubs and beat Catherine so severely with the clubs that she could not stand. She also pulled out all of her hair and then left her lying in the road. Rebecca then fled the scene. When Mr. Smith returned home, he swore out a warrant for the arrest of Rebecca Arnold Jones. Mr. Hatcher, the acting sheriff at the time, came to the home of Sarah Hale because he had heard that Rebecca was staying there. When Hatcher came into the house, Rebecca hid under the table. Hatcher swore that he would not leave the area without his quarry. With the aid of her family, Rebecca was able to slip out of the house and run to get a pistol from Sam Conley. When Hatcher had left the house, Rebecca had laid in wait and shot the sheriff in the thigh and had killed the horse with the same shot. The sheriff had to be carried out of the area for treatment without his quarry. After threatening John with the same treatment as the sheriff and telling him to send her his mare racehorse, and the fact that Rebecca had beaten his girlfriend nearly to death, John Jones sent the racehorse to Rebecca so that she could escape to Tazewell, Virginia. While she was there, John cleared up the charges against his ex-wife. 3 times John came to Tazewell to reconcile with Rebecca, but she refused to do so. On the 3rd try, they came back together. Jones and the ladies. Now, back in the day, being 12 years old was the same as being in your mid-20s today. You could get married, drink, have children, gamble, or be a responsible working adult. During this time, in his autobiography, Claib speaks about being with several women that year. The first is Miss Cook, who he says he has a good time with. He also speaks of his boss's wife, Sarah Burnett, whom he loved to kiss and go fishing with. Then he speaks about being caught with an orphan girl named Phoenix. He had to leave the area on account of her. The killing of the unknown man. The first murder that Claib Jones admits to was the unknown man. Claib Jones writes of the circumstances behind the murder in his book. According to Jones, he was hired by John Hale to do some work when he was 12 years old. On his way home one day, they stopped at a grocery or saloon. Many people were there. Jones was sick, but he was told to treat everyone there, so he did. A couple of nights later, he was asked to do it again, and refused because he was so ill. Claib was then thrown on the ground and kicked in the face and the head for this refusal. After several weeks of laying in bed recovering from the beating, Claib then spent 3 days in the woods making his way to the then unknown man's house, where he shot him 3 times and killed him. No one suspected Claib for the killing of the man. Claib Jones marries the Epperson girl. According to his autobiography, Claib had met and married an Epperson girl while he was staying in Tennessee with his father. Claib was 16 years old at the time of his marriage. The marriage only lasted 1 month after Claib moved into their house. He states that he caught on to her tricks and left. After this, he went back to Floyd County and went to work in Melansburg. While there, he met Martha Hubbard. And as soon as her family found out that he was married, he had to break off the relationship. 2 more unknown men. After leaving Melansburg, Claib went to work on the coal boats that ran from Big Sandy River to Cincinnati. On one of the stops in a place called Hanging Rock, they went to a brothel. The men were asked to leave after only being there for a few minutes by 2 African American men. Claib killed the 2 men and left the brothel. He got back safely to the coal ship and finished the trip. He then went to his father's house, picked up some supplies, and then hid in the woods. Claib marries Matilda Fisher and has a child. Claib was 21 years old when he made his way to Lawrence County, Ohio. While he was there, he met and married Matilda Fisher. Claib had to have the father's consent as Matilda was underage. 1 year later, her father, Fred Fisher, found out that Claib was still married to a woman in Tennessee. Fisher told his daughter about the marriage and caused quite a bit of trouble between Claib and his wife Matilda. Claib told Fisher that Matilda had no knowledge of this and told him to leave them alone. The trouble became too much, and Claib decided to end the fight between himself and the Fisher family. He loaded up his team and went to Ironton. He then sold the team, and then he moved on to Floyd County, Kentucky. 6 months later, Claib found out that she had given birth to a baby girl. Lizzie Birch. Claib states he was 23 years old when he went to Buena Vista Furnace and was hired to do farmhand work by Harvey Birch. Birch was a mean man and a drunkard, but he had a good wife and a pretty 14-year-old daughter named Lizzie. Claib and Lizzie were gathering grapes alone together one day, and Mrs. Birch accused them of doing something wrong. She told her husband, and Mr. Birch refused to pay him for his labor. Jones left the home over the conflict. 2 weeks later, Lizzie came to Jones, and they ran away together to Canonsburg in Carter County, Ohio. After 2 weeks, Jones came back to Birch to straighten out the matter, but faced kidnapping charges and a reward of $500 for his capture. Jones escaped and went back to Lizzie. He then took Lizzie to Carter County and hid her there, saying nothing of what had happened. By this time, Birch was wanting to kill Jones over his daughter. One day, Jones snuck up on Birch, pointed his gun, and told him to draw or leave him alone. Birch demanded that Jones marry his daughter, but Jones refused on grounds that he had already 2 wives. Jones then told Birch to take his daughter and leave him alone. Chrissy, Holbrook. After several years of going to church at Old Baptist, Jones decided if he found a good wife that he would live the rest of his days for the Lord. However, there came a time when he gave up this idea and started gambling. At the age of 23 years old, he went to Letcher County, Kentucky with Lee Hall. Together, they got into a game with Jim Sarver and George Bashirs. Jones and Hall won all of the money and decided to take their women, who were Chrissy Holbrook and Shine Polly. Holbrook and Jones would marry and have 2 children together. Jones did all he could to live in peace with her. He recollects that his favorite hobby to do during this time was hunting in the woods with his dog Bolly. After some time, the fighting between Chrissy and Claib became too much, and Chrissy left Claib because of it. Jones did not go after his wife, but instead went to the home of his father and stayed with him. Adeline Gayhart. While at his father's home, Jones reconnected with a childhood friend named Adeline Gayhart. While going to pay her a visit, Jones was surprised to see a man there named Nelson Mosley. Now Mosley was dressed up in his finery to court Miss Gayhart, saying that no man could take Miss Adeline away from him. Some time later at an event, Nelson and his brothers Lewis and Kells Mosley met up with Claib. They got into a fight with Claib and stabbed him 13 times. He states that his wife came back to him and his mother came to live with him while he recovered from the stabbing. He also states that Lewis and Kells Mosley did not live long after the stabbing, having been ambushed and killed. He doesn't say who did the murders, only that they happened. The fight with the Coburn family. Claib talks about his politics as being a Democrat. However, he felt that he needed to join the Union despite his political affiliations. This did not sit well with the Coburn family, as we shall soon discover. As soon as Mr. Coburn had found out that Claib had joined the Union Army, he turned him in as being a Yankee. Coburn then took measures to have Claib removed from his home on the threat of harm or death. Claib took to the woods in hiding away from people to keep this from happening. Feeling that his removal was not a strong enough message, the Coburn family went inside of the cabin and robbed it, then burned it to the ground. This left Claib's wife and children homeless. Feeling very angry about the mistreatment of his wife and children, Claib caught one of the Coburn family members walking down the road with the Jones family household goods in tow. Jones and Coburn began to fight about who rightfully owned the goods. Coburn pulled out a large knife on Jones. Jones pulled out his pistol and knocked the knife out of the hand of Coburn. Jones then knocked down Coburn, picked up the knife, and took several swipes at Coburn and left him laying on the road. This might mean that Claib either killed the man or severely wounded him. Federal forces. Claib went to Perry County, where he enlisted with Tom Johnson from the United States Army, who was raising a battalion of soldiers. They soon had enough men and went to Harlan County to join with the Harlan Battalion. There, they elected Mr. Blankenship to be their major. The battalion was mustered into the Union Army on October 13, 1862, and were mustered out of the Harlan Battalion on January 13, 1863. Clay became the first lieutenant under Captain George W. Morgan of Company A. Jones was in charge of scouting and advice on how to conduct raids. Capture and escape. While going to Floyd County to see his wife and mother, Jones was captured by Colonel Caudill, who took him to Letcher County under heavy guard. While in Letcher County, they were camping at Rock House and stayed in the area for 3 days and nights. Jones learned that Caudill's company was ordered to Richmond, Virginia, and he was determined that he would not go with them. The weather was cold, so there was a huge fire built at the mouth of the tent. Jones laid down at the outer edge of the tent and began working the tent pegs loose. Once they were loose, he turned over to survey his surroundings. He spotted a pistol that a guard had laid on the end of a log of wood. As soon as the guards were asleep, he grabbed the gun, laid back down, and lifted up the tent that he had removed the tent pegs from, and rolled out of the tent and made good his escape. The tent that he was held in was located in the middle of the camp, but he was able to get out of the camp without being seen. To keep from freezing to death, Jones ran all night along the ridge of the hills. About 11 o'clock the next day, he followed the young man to the old live breeding farm and asked for a meal from Mr. Breeding, who was a Union man. He was given dinner and told where he could fill his canteen full of moonshine whiskey. After drinking enough to make him feel brave, he left the area. After walking a mile, Jones crossed paths with Colonel Ben Caudill. Caudill drew his sword, demanding that Jones turn around. Jones drew his gun and told Caudill to leave him alone and go on his way. Jones didn't know if the gun would work or not, so this was a bluff. Caudill didn't know that it was a bluff and turned around and went his way, but put out a $500 reward for his capture. The two would meet again as Jones helped to capture Caudill at Gladeville, Virginia. While making his way back to the Union camp, Jones met up with 2 other Union men, and they made a raid on a rebels' camp about 5 miles below Whitesburg, Kentucky. After firing upon the rebels, Jones was able to get a man named Mitchell away from his horse. Jones took Mitchell and his horse both to the Union camp with him. Jones captures Stamper. This is the story of how First Lieutenant Claib Jones captured Captain Hiram H. Stamper. Misfortune often befalls those of us that takes things into excess. The love of apple brandy, often called applejack, is no exception. In Letcher County, during the Civil War, Aunt Cynthia Boggs owned an apple orchard. But this was not her primary income. Her fortune came from the production and distribution of the alcoholic beverage known as applejack, which was very popular in colonial America as a drink of choice. But for Confederate Captain Hiram H. Stamper, his well-known love of the drink would bring about his downfall. Stamper's love for the drink was such that he strategically placed his camp and command near the Boggs farm in Whitesburg in order to protect this valuable Civil War resource. Learning of Stamper's unmitigated love of the drink led First Lieutenant Jones to concoct a plan to reunite Stamper with his love. Marching all night, Jones and his company made their way silently to the farm and laid in wait in the woods. Hiding in the brush, the Union scouts observed the Confederate camp for over a day. That evening, Captain Stamper would once again visit his love at the Boggs farm. Carrying 2 empty jugs across his saddle, he made his way to the farmhouse. After an ample time, an argument broke out at the farmhouse between Stamper and Boggs over payment. Jones, seizing the moment, took 2 of his men and went into the house, drew their guns on Captain Stamper, and forced him to surrender. Stamper resisted capture and put up such a fuss that Jones agreed to have the jugs filled for him and paid for it, so that Stamper would come peaceably. Jones then sent a girl with a note telling Stamper's men that he was now a captive, and that if they were fired upon, Stamper would be killed immediately. Jones then mounted the horse and took Stamper to the camp. In the meantime, Colonel Caudill had captured Federal Captain Webb. Under the flag of truce, a prisoner exchange was held in which Webb was exchanged for Stamper. Attempted capture of Jones and the rebel camp raid. A few weeks after this, Major Blankenship had let his men go home for a 5-day furlough. The rebels got wind that the men were on their way back and began to capture them on the road one at a time. Colonel Cottle was also lying in wait for Jones so that he could capture or kill him by himself and not have to pay the reward money. Jones had gotten word of this while he was still at his home. Jones was able to avoid the capture. When darkness fell, the rebels tried to cross the mountain back to their camp. They came across a company of their own men and got into a fight with them, which caused an escape of most of the Union men that had been captured. Major Blankenship was mad and made a raid on the rebel camp, but lost 2 men in the attack. Battle for Leatherwood. One of the most well-known battles in eastern Kentucky was for the township of Leatherwood that took place on October 19, 1862. The story of the Battle of Leatherwood, Kentucky can be found in our video or on our website as the written story of Cottle's Army. You can also find out more information about the 10th Kentucky Rifles with our video or story called the 10th Kentucky Mounted Rifles, the 2 Battles for Whitesburg, Kentucky. Captain David J. Cottle and his men from Company B of the 10th Mounted Rifles were guarding a salt works in Leatherwood, Kentucky. The production of salt was very important to the economy of the area at the time. Captain George Morgan and Lieutenant Claib Jones, with their Harlan County Battalion, came toward Leatherwood to attack the guarding Confederates. They took their positions across a creek from the guards and opened fire. Shots were fired, and several of the men from the 10th Mounted Rifles were wounded. A battle ensued and lasted several minutes. The 10th Mounted Rifles quickly retreated to Whitesburg, Kentucky, because they had lost their position. Jones gives us an account of his part of this event. The plan that Jones and Captain George Morgan came up with was to drive the rebels out of Perry County. On their way, they met and engaged in battle at Leatherwood Creek while the rebels were trying to steal watermelons from a handicapped farmer. 1 man from each side was killed and several men were wounded in the battle. Jones had shot Captain Jesse Cottle in the backside. They had won the battle and gotten the rebels' food away from them. The battle with the Georgia Ann Tigers. The next battle that the Harlan Battalion was involved with was against the Georgia Ann Tigers, who were near Harlan Town. They surrounded their camp and fired upon them before daylight. Even though they formed a line for battle and fired several rounds in return, the rebels lost the day. The battle lasted 3 hours. There was 18 dead and many wounded, and 2 more died of their wounds later that day. Jones says that they buried the dead soldiers and returned to their camp. Colonel Slimp from Virginia. According to Jones, one night Colonel Slimp and his men came from Virginia and ran everyone out of the Union camp. They fought against Slimp the entire time he was occupying their camp. This went on for more than a week before the Union could return to their camp. Nearby to the camp lived a man named Everso who ran a moonshine still. He fired upon the rebels who got too close to his barrel of moonshine. However, the rebels were able to drive Eversole away from his still and captured the brandy. They then proceeded to get drunk with it. Catching the rebels drunk, the Union men then killed 3 of the men and drove the rest of the men out of the camp, and Slimp and his men retreated back to Virginia. Lieutenant Bentley. One of the men in Jones's company was named Gilbert Screech, who lived on Mason's Creek near the salt wells of Perry County. This was 18 miles from camp. Major Kleinworth was at the rebel camp at Salt Wells. Henry Hall, Jones, and Screech went to Screech's house. The next day they went to scout out the rebel camp to find that too many of them were located there, so they kept on going. 1 mile from the camp, the trio of men came across a bunch of rebels in the road. Both sides opened fire upon the other. Jones wounded the lieutenant. The rebels hid in the pine and laurel bushes on the side of the road. The trio had won the day, but had to leave the spoils behind. Guarding sick men at Car Fork. Some time after the small battle at the Salt Wells, Lieutenant Jones and Captain Shade Combs were guarding some incapacitated men at the Stop Gap Hospital camp located at the mouth of Car Fork. Because almost all of the men there were in their makeshift beds at the infirmary. There were only 4 guns in the camp to keep the men safe in an emergency. The small field hospital of sick men made a very appealing target to the rebels who wanted to get rid of the Union soldiers from the area. Seizing the tempting opportunity, rebel Captain Ans Hayes attacked the encampment with a task force several times larger than the number of men that were present. However, this would not prove to be a very easy undertaking. Surprised by the attack, Reverend Ira Combs, Jones, and 2 other soldiers were the only men to have guns in the camp. However, these 4 brave men held off the greater numbers of men as they gave their fellow soldiers time and an opening to escape the area. Seeing that the 4 men were not going to give up their position very easily and that the men were now gone, Captain Hayes did not see the point in continuing the shootout with the 4 men and retreated back to their camp. The 14th Kentucky Cavalry. On January 13, 1863, the Harlan Battalion was scheduled to be mustered out of service. Jones and his men went to Irvine, Kentucky, where they joined the 14th Kentucky Cavalry. Within a week, the cavalry was ordered to move to Richmond, Virginia. Claib Jones was declared to be a disabled man and unable to fight. His men got mad about it, and Colonel Lilly kept Jones on and made him a scout and a spy for the cavalry, as he had experience in that field. William Mosley and Font Fuller were sent out with Jones for these tasks. While spying in Perry County at Mason Creek, they captured a man named Cornet. Mosley and Fuller wanted to kill Cornet for revenge for the rebels burning down Mosley's house. Jones felt that an innocent man should not be killed for what others had done, so he hid Cornet in a cabin from the 2 men to save his life. The 2 men tried several times to get at the 2 men in the cabin, and so Jones gave him a gun to defend himself in case they finally broke in. When the next day came, Cornet and Jones were still safe. Thankful that Jones had protected him through the night, Cornet handed over his guns so that the 2 men headed to Boonesville. They had to stop over in Goose Creek, where there were 3 women there. Jones gave over his guns to the women to guard Cornet while he slept. They agreed to do this because one of the rebels had killed one of their husbands and the other's brother a few weeks before then. The women had expressed that if Cornet had moved so much as an eye muscle in the way of an escape, that they would kill him on the spot. The women kept a good guard on the man, and he was safe until the morning. They moved on to Boonesville, where they caught up to the 14th and Colonel Lilly, where Jones handed over Cornet, his prisoner. The men lifted up Jones on their shoulders and carried him all over the camp for bringing in Cornet safely. This is a yarn that Claib Jones spins in his autobiography about how his men were able to capture, bury, and resurrect Confederate General Applejack Barrel and turn him into a general for the Union that helped to inspire the troops. Colonel Lilly ordered Jones with a posse of men to Letcher County, Kentucky. It took them 2 days to reach Whitesburg. Once they reached Sandlick, they were beset upon by rebels who retreated towards Virginia after the first few volleys. Running after their quarry, they spotted a wagon crossing a point above town and seized the wagon from the rebels that was full of dried apples and applejack. They filled their canteens full of the tasty brandy and toasted to their new capture, Confederate General Applejack Barrel. They decided to bury the general beside the road, and the spirits that they had partaken of moved John Smith of their party to conduct a moving funeral of Confederate General Applejack Barrel. They emptied the wagon of all the apples and filled it with fence posts and burned it. Later, they captured Mr. Sturtevant, that told them that the rebels would return. Jones then stationed his men at the gap below the mill dam and waited for them to return. They waited until the rebels had passed by them before they opened fire. They chased them back across the Virginia line. After the rebels had been dispatched once and for all, Jones and his men went back to the grave of Confederate General Applejack Barrel, and miraculously he was resurrected and convinced of the error of his ways. He was then persuaded to serve as a Union general and brought back to camp, whereupon he was able to inspire the troops to stay for a couple of days of merriment. Mr. Sturtevant became known as Jones' pet rebel, and they played poker with the men and won all of the money in the camp and courted lots of ladies from the area. After this, Mr. Sturtevant swore not to pick up any arms against the Union soldiers and was allowed to return home. The rebel camp was pretty disheartened at the thought of losing the general in such an undignified manner, and to learn that he had turned coat and now ran with the Union army. As soon as Colonel Cottle had learned that Jones had whipped the men who guarded the general, he took his men and faded into the woods of eastern Kentucky. Miles Webb. Miles Webb was the brother-in-law to Jones. He was captured with Mr. Williams by Jones and his men. Jones and his men and the two prisoners stayed with a man named Cottle. During that time they had some girls make everyone some supper. While they were eating, rebels had surrounded Jones and his men. Shots were fired from both sides, and Jones and the men were able to escape except for his brother-in-law, Miles Webb. He had died while trying to escape. The rebels then retreated back to Whitesburg. First rounds of raids. Jones learned that Captain Hayes was at the mouth of Lott's Creek below Hazard, Kentucky. Colonel Lilly ordered Captain Strong to take a company of men to break up the rebels' camp. While the rebel camp was cooking breakfast, the company, along with Jones, surrounded the camp and drove the rebels out of their camp. In the capture, there were several guns, ammunition, coffee, several jugs of moonshine, and the Union men also ate the breakfast that the rebels had been making that morning. After breakfast, they set out for Letcher County. On the way, they ran into Captain Cook's company on Car Fork. Like Captain Hayes' men, they also fled for the woods. In the fight, Jones shot and killed Lieutenant Mays. Continuing their journey to Letcher County, they ran into another group of rebels that was headed by Captain League Hicks. Running out of the house and behind a tree stump, Captain Hicks surrendered to the Union group of men. Jones made sure of the safety of Hicks as he stayed at his house many years before when he was wounded. When Captain Strong, Jones, and all of the men reached Whitesburg, the rebels had gone back to Virginia. On this particular raid, they had killed or captured 13 rebel men without losing a single Union soldier. The company then returned to Boonesville. Second round of raids. Jones was again told to gather a posse and head to Letcher County for raids by Colonel Lilly. When the group got to Whitesburg the second time, there was not any rebel camps on the way. However, the men did capture 2 rebel deserters. While buying cucumbers from a lady on Mason's Creek, gunshots rang through the air, and Jones found 2 prisoners that were shot to death by a man named Calhoun. The posse left the area and went back to Boonesville. From Boonesville, they were headed to Camp Nelson. On the way, Calhoun fell out with Leslie Johnson and killed him over a dispute over the 2 prisoners that Calhoun had shot and killed previously. Calhoun fled to Ohio. The Round Bottom Camp. Captain Foster with his men were at Round Bottom robbing and stealing what they could from the area. Jones took Captain Strong's men and marched on their camp. They took a rebel spy who told them that the men would return to the camp. They waited in hiding until the group of men passed them and then opened fire. 10 men were killed in the skirmish and 17 were captured. Again, no member of the Union side was lost in the fray. The Last Battle. While Jones was at Camp Nelson, he learned that General John H. Morgan was in the area. Before Jones and his men could engage Morgan and his infamous raiders, they had crossed into the Ohio. However, his company was sent to engage Colonel Clay instead. At the mouth of Puncheon Creek on Licking River, the two sides met. Colonel Clay was killed and his men broke up in confusion. The 14th was then called back to Fort Nelson, and they were mustered out of service, for the Civil War had now ended with the surrender of General Lee at Appomattox, Virginia. Claib and Chrissy. After the Civil War, Jones returned to Boonesville to stay with his mother for a short time. He moved to Big Sinking Creek in Carter County, Kentucky, and lived there 8 years with his wife, Chrissy Holbrook Jones. This was not a very happy 8 years. There were constant arguments and squabbles, and Chrissy would leave for a week at a time and come back home again to Claib. Finally, the two had enough and would separate for a time. Claib gave Chrissy all she wanted out of the house and $50, and the understanding that she would not come back to him or bother him any more. She agreed and took up with a man named Underwood, and they moved to Ohio together. Underwood was not kind to Chrissy, and so she became a victim of domestic crimes. Underwood took all of her money and sent her away from him. She came back to Claib asking for a reconciliation. However, during her absence, Claib had become involved with a woman named Handshoe, and they had 2 children together. Chrissy was not satisfied to learn that Claib and Handshoe had been living happily together, so she caused all kinds of trouble that she could for the couple. Trouble with the Bear and Brown families. There was trouble between Claib and the Bear and Brown families because of an old sweetheart of Claib's. Lazarus Bear married Sarah Brown, who also had a younger sister. Because of the previous relationship, the Bear family decided that Jones needed to be taught a lesson. The day was set on the following Saturday at a treat at Big Springs on Sinking Creek. Their bully, Jim Brown, would be the man who would come against Jones. Unaware of the trouble brewing, Jones met up with the Bear and Brown families and began drinking moonshine with them. Everything was going fine until Jim asked Claib if he was doing okay. After Claib said that he was, then Jim told him that he was going to fight with him. Claib told him to go ahead and try, and the fisticuffs began. Brown had a large natural target on his face, his nose, and Claib hit it square, and Brown fell to the ground. Claib then took advantage of the situation and defeated Brown without a scratch on his person. This did not satisfy the Bear family, and one of them drew out his knife on Claib. In response, Claib also drew out his own knife and began to dash toward him. As soon as Claib jumped at the man, he ran and hid behind the skirts of Mrs. Amy Brown. Claib then exclaimed, quote, "Boys, there is one bear gone to hoe," unquote. The fight was over. Claib claims that the men had it out for him after that, but that the women of the family were fine friends with him. Claib was summoned to court for a week. While he was away, the bears came to his farm to steal his corn, broke into his smokehouse, and took all of his bacon. Claib smoked his meat in a process called sugar cured. Red peppers are used with the salting process of smoking the meat. Claib swore out a warrant and found 2 sides of his bacon at the Bear house and 2 sides of bacon at Jim Brown's property hidden in a cliff. But this event had to be answered for. In retaliation, Claib stole Jim Brown's fine weather sheep. A weather sheep is a male sheep that has been castrated at a younger age to keep them from becoming aggressive. Jones watched Brown take the sheep home and tie it to a tree in his yard near his home, and then walk into the house. Jones then took the opportunity and untied the sheep, took it home and killed the mutton for Brown. Jim Brown looked everywhere for his sheep except for Jones' smokehouse, which Claib had put it in. The Holbrook Underwood War. There are many versions of this feud, and in most of them Claib Jones is mentioned at the siege of Underwood Fort. A story of the feud officially is recorded in Mount Sterling Gazette, as found in the Kentucky Explorer, January 1999 edition, pages 29 and 30. Quote, the quarrel began just after the war in September 1865. Jesse Underwood, the son of old George Underwood, got into a barroom quarrel with a man who called for a Jeff Davis drink, and in the fight that ensued, George Trumbo was shot and killed by Jesse. Many efforts were made by the authorities to capture Jesse, and in one of the raids on the Underwood fort, Squire Holbrook shot and seriously wounded the young man. Thus started the feud between the two families. At length Jesse tried to avoid so much fighting, went to Iowa, and then there was peace for a time. Hostilities were renewed, however, when old George Underwood posted bail for some men charged with horse stealing. This war was soon in full progress again, and many were killed on both sides. Unquote. Claib gives his account of the Holbrook Underwood War, but because of possible retaliation, he does tell us who was killed in the war, but doesn't give the names of those who were involved in the killing of those men. Remember, Claib already was seeing trouble in his own house when his wife was a Holbrook, took up with a man named Underwood. Although the two events are not related, it is very interesting that once again the two surnames would enter Claib's life. This account takes place after Jesse Underwood went to Iowa and before his return to the mountains. The Fort Underwood Siege. According to Claib, quote, the trouble began over a dogfight at the burial of Old Man Pendulum. Unquote. A few days after the funeral, Alex Pendulum was bushwhacked and shot from the bush. The sniper was a member of the Holbrook clan, and the Holbrooks gave orders that no one should call a doctor to come and help the man, under threat that they would share in Alex's fate. George Underwood heard that Pendulum was shot and immediately went for the doctor. Upon his return, Underwood was also shot in the ambush. John Martin, who was living in Carter County at the time, was given orders to leave the area or die. On leaving the area, Martin got sick and stayed with Lewis Underwood at his home to recover. Martin then recovered and stayed the night at Claib Jones' home to try to reach a doctor at Olive Hill for his wife, who was also ill. During that time, Lewis Underwood was ambushed and shot in his yard while he was going outside to get some firewood for a fire. Alvis Underwood was sent for, and he and John Martin followed the trail left by the person who had ambushed Lewis. The trail led the two men back to the home of a Holbrook. Both men returned and took Lewis to his father's home, which is now called Fort Underwood. Claib becomes involved in the feud. Miss Vena Martin took John Martin's wife home with her, and John Martin stayed at Fort Underwood. Dr. John Steele came to attend Lewis at the fort and hired Claib to come and help, as he had a great amount of experience attending the wounded men because of the Civil War. Word was sent to Claib by the Stamper family that if he did not leave the fort, that they would kill his children and burn his house to the ground. Claib sent back word to the Stampers that if they had no houses, they could talk about burning his. In other words, he was telling them that if they burned down his house and killed his children, he would do the same thing to them. There were only 5 armed men at the Underwood fort at that time, and they were low on ammunition and arms. However, 3 men would stand guard, and the other 2 men would kill crows, a word used in this story to mean men who were attacking them. The Stamper and Holbrooks outmanned the fort, and the Stampers attacked the fort several times. However, old George Underwood had a sister that smuggled arms and ammo into the fort to help the men there. Included in the arms was Claib's champee, which was a bear gun. She also stayed with the men during the entire siege on the fort. 2 men were away from the fort, hidden at all times to act as snipers protecting the fort. The password for them to get back into the fort was, quote, "Another crow has fallen," unquote. This was to indicate that a man had been taken care of. One morning there was word sent that 7 men had fallen. They were not found until sometime later, and their bodies were badly decomposed. The Stampers call in the law. After the bodies were found, the Stamper parties tried to call in the sheriff of Carter County to investigate. The sheriff flatly refused to get involved in the quarrel. The Stampers then went to Grayson to get a police force to take the fort. The police sent word that they were going to attack the fort and kill everyone inside. The attack on the fort. Just before dawn, the attack on Fort Underwood took place. Jones was downstairs attending to the wounded when the shots rang out. Everyone began fortifying the weak places in the building and placing complete beds, mattresses, and tables to bar the windows and doors. Eventually, the balls stopped flying through the air of the fort. The occupants of the house was then able to return fire. The call for help had already been sent out for the Underwood family in the fort because they had been expecting trouble. The fight continued until 10 o'clock in the morning. Shooting stopped when Alvis Underwood's wife was sent in to tell them to surrender. The occupants refused and said they were willing to fight on. The frustrated police and men retreated the area. 7 of the police force were wounded and 2 were killed in the attack, and 2 more were dying of their wounds. During the fight, George Lewis Underwood was mortally wounded. Dr. John Steele told everyone that Underwood was going to die. So, Underwood confessed religion and asked to be baptized. So the women who were still in the fort went out to the branch and built a small dam to contain water. Underwood was carried out to this place and baptized. He died soon after this took place. According to the Roots Web website, this matter had become so large that the Kentucky Governor McCleary became involved. He sent weapons and J.N. Stewart with 40 local guardsmen to the area with the express instructions to keep the order. With the order in hand, the soldiers came to Fort Underwood and arrested the occupants except for John Martin and Claib Jones. Both men had escaped and went to Floyd County. The entire siege lasted 19 days. Jones on the run. Even though Jones escaped the siege, it was not over for him yet. He had a reward out for his person of $700. While he was at Salt Lick, the Coburns tried to arrest him for the reward money. However, they didn't get the chance to do it, as Jones still had his gun on his person and he kept them at a distance. Seeing how he was not safe in Floyd County, Jones then fled to Letcher County. He stayed with Miles Webb about 5 miles above Whitesburg, Kentucky. While staying with Webb, John Wright came there to ask Jones to go with him to Whitesburg. Jones explained the situation to Wright about the reward for his arrest and that he was afraid to go to town with him. Wright promised to befriend Jones and told him that he would keep him from being arrested if he went to town with him. Sure enough, as Jones and Wright rode into town on horseback, there were parties there to arrest Jones. Jones told Wright what was going on. Jones and Wright confronted the parties, and Wright told them that he had Jones in his charge and that no one should touch him. This saved Jones a lot of trouble, and he talks favorably about Wright and what he did for him. Later, Jones and Wright would get into their own feud that hit the newspapers everywhere. But for now, we will leave Jones in this section of the story and pick up next time with his life on the run. Moving onward. After Wright had prevented the arrest of Claib, Jones felt that it was high time to leave Letcher County. Jones took his family to the Osborne farm and stayed long enough to produce one crop. Jones talks about how Osborne was a high stepper. That means someone who loves to seek unrestrained pleasure in life. Jones says that they got along great together and had many sprees. A spree is a bout or spell of drinking to intoxication. Even though Osborne and Jones got along well together, Jones felt that he should not stay in one place too long at that time. Woman trouble. After the planting season was over, Jones moved on to Caney Fork, a Beaver, to rent a farm. While he was there, the sheriff of Floyd County, Bill Hall, paid Jones to keep Hall's mistress, whose last name was Moore, away from him and his family, as she had been causing a lot of trouble in his marriage. Jones took her in and started courting her. The sheriff came back to see his mistress one more time, but she told him to get gone from her and not to come back, as she had chosen to be with Claib. Jones then met a second beautiful girl, he calls her a speckled pup, by the name of Justice, who moved in with him during the same time. However, both girls did not get along and did not like sharing the affections of Jones. They would get into a lot of fist fights and bouts of hair pulling over him. They would fight so often that he would call one Joe and the other Big Bill. Finally, Claib had enough and told both of them to take it outside and fight it out. Claib wanted to have both ladies live with him as his women, but the girls wanted him to decide which one that he wanted to be with the most. At last, all decided that they could not agree on the living arrangement, and so the two girls left. Moving around some more. Claib decided it would be for the best if he went west. So he sold everything he had and moved to Wichita, Kansas for a spell with his mother. He did not stay there very long because his mother became gravely ill. On his way back to Floyd County with his mother, he made it to Colton, Kentucky, where she died. It was a very sad moment for Claib, as he laid to rest the best friend he ever had. After that, Claib once again went back to Carter County to raise a crop on a piece of land that he rented from Mr. Sizemore on Turkey Creek. However, Mr. Sizemore was not fair in his dealings with Claib. After Sizemore had harvested his own crop, he set his cows loose in Claib Jones's section of the farmland without giving Claib any notice. This action made Jones mad, as they were eating his corn that he had planted. Claib walked out of his house, went out into the field, and killed 3 cattle over the matter. Then sent word to Sizemore that he had beef that needed to be taken care of. Needless to say, Claib had left the farm after this conflict. Still on the run. After the conflict with Sizemore, Claib went eastward to West Virginia. His companions were John and Harry Fultz. On the way there, they found an abandoned cabin by the river at Sewell, West Virginia. It looked like it had not been lived in for some time, so the men decided that it would make a good shelter on their journey. Later that evening, Jones heard a pack of dogs chasing a deer. After killing the deer, a man and a woman who were across the river brought the deer to him and offered the men a place to stay. Claib talks about eating the deer and drinking moonshine that night with the couple, and then the next morning bidding the couple goodbye. Jones Camp. When Jones and his party reached Beech Mountain, they met up with and stayed with an elderly gentleman that Jones calls an old sager. The next day they paid him some money to hire him and his horse to take them to a shanty on Beech Mountain. From this point onward in the story, this is called the Jones Camp. The first day of hunting did not go very well, as the only quarry that was found was a wolf that one of the other party members had killed. The next day they found bear tracks. that led them through a rough or thick overgrowth of woods. They drew lots, and it fell upon Claib Jones to go after the bear. While hunting for the bear, Jones came into a clearing in which there were 2 deer standing in the middle of it. Jones was able to kill both deer with one shot of his gun. He took the quarry back to the cabin and ate venison for a while. Harry Fultz, the father of the pair, became sick one day, so they left him at the camp to guard it, so that Jones and John Fultz could do some hunting. They were able to kill 2 turkeys that day. Dog trouble. After spending a few days at the Jones camp, John Fultz and Jones made their way to the Falls of the Kanawha. While on Cherry River, the pair of men met a man on a wagon who had 2 hound dogs for sale. Jones bought the dogs and went on his way with them. Before he was able to reach the falls, a man met him on the way and told Jones that they were his dogs. The dogs acted familiar with the man. Jones told the man to repay him his money and he could have the dogs back. An argument broke out and Jones threatened to shoot the man if he didn't back down. The man took him at his word and backed down. Jones told the man that if he told the owner to pay him back his money, that the dogs would be returned. After missing a meeting time, Jones took the dogs back home with him by train. The owner of the dogs did reach him and paid him back his money, and Claib gave back the dogs without a fight. The first insult in the Jones-Hall-Wright feud. While still living in Floyd County at Jones Fort, Claib was living a life of hunting and semi-peace and quiet. He had trouble, but it was nothing really major. However, this would all soon change. According to Jones, this would be the event that would start the hard feelings between himself and Hall and Wright. This would escalate with further events. A young man named Fultz had killed a man during the Carter County War or Holbrook Underwood feud. He had a $700 reward for his capture and arrest to face charges for this murder. Fultz had made his way to Jones Fort to ask for protection from the law. Claib agreed to help him and hid him in the place where he thought that no one could find the young man. The next day, United States Marshal Tom Prater and a posse of men came knocking at Jones Fort. Claib was in the bed but told the men to come on in. Prater asked Jones where the young man was, and Claib answered that he was hidden and that, quote, "We're eating my own chickens and then no man could get him," unquote. Prater flew mad at Jones, but Jones reached under his pillow and grabbed his pistol and aimed it at Prater. He also reached across and grabbed his old Champy gun and drew it near himself. Needless to say, Prater and his posse left the cabin alone after that point. A few days later, Talton Hall, Black Hawk Sizemore, and old John Wright came after Fultz. The same words were exchanged. However, Claib did offer, even if the group of men gave him $50 to bring Fultz out into the yard, that they still would not be able to arrest him. This was a huge insult to Wright, Hall, and Sizemore. The men left the cabin very angry. The second insult in the Jones-Hall-Wright feud. Claib talks about moving to Knott County to the head of Beaver Creek close to where he was born. He rented a farm for 2 growing seasons from Ben Hall, who was a merchant. One day, while leaving the store, Jones met up with Todd Hall and Bill Bates. They asked Jones to join their clan. They told Claib that under their gang that he would no longer have to worry, that old John Wright was their captain, and that he would not let any of his men suffer under the law. Jones let them know that he was no longer in any trouble with the law and that he wished to remain so. That for him the answer was no. Hall and Bates did not take too kindly to this answer and was mad at Jones for the refusal. Death of Frank Saylers. Once again we hear the name of Frank Saylers. This is Jones' eyewitness testimony as to what happened to Saylers that fateful day. Frank Saylers lived on Beaver Creek 1 mile from Jones. He had a lewd wife who had a loose reputation. Talton Hall stayed at Saylers' home most of his time when he was out on a raid. It didn't take long for Saylers to catch on to what his wife and Hall were doing together. He had enough, and he left for Wise County, Virginia. Saylers stayed there for a while, and on his way back to Kentucky, he stayed several days with John Wright at his home on Elkhorn Creek near Pound Gap, in what is now known as Jenkins, Kentucky. Bill Lee Hall, who was the brother of Todd Hall, was also staying with Wright, and came on to Beaver Creek to tell his brother where Saylers was, and that in a few days he would be home again. In the meantime, Jones had been clearing some land for planting and needed to put up some fencing. He went around looking for hired hands to help him with the project. On his way back home, Jones witnessed Hall and Willie Bates walking with Saylers behind a corn crib. Hall was walking in front of Saylers, and Bates was walking behind him with his hand on the lock of his gun. Jones claims that it was at this point that he stepped up to Hall and begged for Saylers' life. Hall replied that he would not have killed Saylers then, but that he was in this world for a short time. Claib saw that this was a great time to get away from the men and took off for home, because he knew if Saylers was to die right then and there, that he would also be killed for witnessing the act. Later that evening, Saylers was shot and killed as he stepped out onto the steps of his house by some men who were standing in the corner of his house. Bill Bates was the major, Bill Hawk Sizemore was the constable, and Tommy Talton was the judge, and whatever Tommy said was the law. The next day an inquest for the death of Saylers was held. The neighbors and Jones were expected to attend because it was summoned by Sizemore. The inquest ended with a ruling that Saylers had been killed by some unknown person for some unknown reason. However, proof was given at the inquest that about dark that evening, Todd had sent George Johnson and Willie Bates, two of his lieutenants, away, even though that there was a big snow on the ground. Hall told Saylers to step out to see if it was not raining. Saylers stepped out onto the porch and said, quote, "Frank, it is sure enough raining," unquote. And then Saylers was shot. Hall ran upstairs and fired the signal gun from the loft to let everyone know that Saylers was dead. The funeral. The next day, Jones goes to Saylers' home to find Hall and Saylers' widow laying across the bed. The couple got up, and the woman was sitting on Hall's lap at the hearth as Jones and Bill Cook dressed Saylers for his funeral. Willie Bates came into the house and drew his gun on Claib, only to have it caught by Sizemore. Jones sat on the bed, and Bates sat next to him with his gun cocked on his shoulder. Jones moved closer to Bates to catch his gun in case he tried to shoot him. Jones states that if the men were not at the front door watching him, that he would have taken Bates' gun and finished him off. But, as it was, Claib helped to take hold of the coffin and carry out the corpse to his grave. On the way to where they were going to bury Saylers, which was not far from Claib's home, he slipped away from the crowd and made a beeline straight for his house. He looked out of a window, and there was Hall on Saylers' horse with the widow right behind him. Claib states that he had lent his bear gun to someone at that time, but he wished that he had it so that he could have ended the whole farce. But, as it was, Jones watched as the jolly party made their way to Bill Bates's fort, while Hall was playing Sour Mountain on his fiddle. At this point, Claib was afraid to stay at his house, so he and his family went to stay with Ben Hall at his home. The next day, one of Todd Hall's spies came to the store and invited Jones and Ben Hall to go with him up the creek. Fearing that this was a planned ambush, Jones and Ben Hall took action. Ben Hall and his wife took his horse and went 5 miles to the home of Miles Hall. Claib Jones took a different path through the woods and met Ben Hall there. Jones' wife would go back home and stay there until Jones sent word to her for her next move. Forged letter and trouble. When Claib Jones' wife had reached the home, she found that the roof had been torn off of the smokehouse and all of the meat was stolen. Also, the meal barrel had been turned over, as well as a huge mess had been left around the house. The same day that Saylers was buried, George Johnson and Willie Bates gave false testimony that they found a letter written by Ben Hall's wife that Claib had been hired by Ben Hall to kill Saylers. With everything mounting against them, Hall and Jones felt that they needed to leave the area immediately. Just as Ben Hall was fixing to leave for safety, Big John Hall alerted everyone that Todd Hall, John Wright, and several others were 1/2 a mile away hiding in the forks of the creek. Unarmed Jones took to the woods and fled to Sherwood Osborne's and got a .45 gun off of him for protection. Claib goes for help. Ben Hall's father, Captain Bolin Hall, was at Mount Sterling at the time taking care of his stock. He came back to the country and gathered Ben, his wife, and Jones's wife to take back with him. Claib had went through the mountains and made it to Hindman, the county seat of Knott County. While there, Jones took out warrants for the parties who had murdered Saylers. However, the sheriff nor any of the county officials were willing to take up the warrants against Hall and his band of outlaws. Jones then went to Dick Vance for help in the matter. Attempted murder of Dick Vance. According to Jones, there had been an attempt on Dick Vance's life by the Todd Hall gang. This was because Vance was also a moonshiner that was facing federal charges for moonshining in Catlettsburg, which is located in Boyd County, Kentucky. Vance had been staying in a room with John Adams from Letcher County, Kentucky. Due to Vance not being able to sleep that night, he saw one of Hall's spies enter his room, strike a match, and look at his face. Vance let the spy leave the room and went to a separate part of the hotel to go to bed. This saved John Vance's life, as not long after that, John Adams' sleeping body was hurled out of a third-floor story window by Todd Hall, Uriah Bates, and Andy Hall. Adams had been shackled by both hands and feet as he was on the way to Louisville, Kentucky to face federal charges. There are sources that state that Adams had jumped out of the window on his own accord to escape the charges. These sources claim that Todd Hall was on guard duty at that time. Several other sources state that Adams was murdered as it was a case of mistaken identity. Death of Andy Hall and Linville Higgins. One of the suggested starting points of the feud comes from the deaths of Andy Hall and Linville Higgins. We do have a record of Linville's death taking place on August 15, 1884. Upon the return of Vance to Knott County from federal court, Vance waylaid and shot Andy Hall from a hidden spot in the brush. The Linville Higgins Find a Grave source states that Vance shot Hall while he was climbing a fence with a sack of potatoes on his back. It is thought that Linville Higgins and Andy Sloan also participated in the shooting of Andy Hall. It was not long after the death of Andy Hall that Linville Higgins was murdered. According to the Appalachian Quarterly, September 1998, quote, "Old Dave Hall, father of Talton Hall, had been considered as a suspect in the murder of Linville Higgins. However, Dave Hall, who was also father of Andrew Hall, had no part in the killing other than possibly relishing the death of one of the gang that had murdered his son. 3 men were indicted for the Higgins murder, one of which was positively identified as Wash Craft of Letcher County. 2 other suspects were Sam Wright and Benjamin Jones." Unquote. According to the Linville Higgins Find a Grave source, quote, 3 men were identified for the Higgins murder, one of which was positively identified as Wash Craft of Letcher County. 2 other suspects were Sam Wright and Benjamin Jones. Sam, known as, quote, "Kinky-haired Sam," unquote, was the son of Joel E. and Eliza Wright and brother of Devil John Wright. It is also mentioned that William S. Wright was implicated in this murder. W.S. was the son of Sidney Wright and cousin of Devil John. Unquote. We will swing back around to this event next week as John Wright would face off against Deputy Sheriff Dolph Drawn and enter the feud. Missed opportunities. According to the Autobiography of Claib Jones, the first missed opportunity to capture Hall came when Vance, Jones, and their men were within 40 yards of Hall sitting in his yard reading a newspaper. It began to snow, and so Hall walked into Fort Bates, and the men had to give up the hunt. Hall got wind that the men were after him and went to Fort Wright for safety, and only returned when the men put out a rumor that they had left for Ohio. The second missed opportunity came when Hall, dressed in Saylers' clothing and driving his oxen, passed by the party unrecognized. His identity was later confirmed by Jones and German Isaacs. The group was able to gather 5 more men from the Isaacs family and returned for another try to arrest Hall. Fort Bates shootout according to Claib Jones. After all the men and guns were gathered, it was time to go to Fort Bates. Everyone was in the house, but there was something odd about the appearance of the area. Nell Bates, Todd Hall's sister, walked out of the house, walked to the road, looked up and down the road, walked around the house, and then up the hill. Soon afterward, Bill Bates and Black Hawk Sizemore came out of the fort and went up to the barn. Then, all of a sudden, Hall and his men came out of the back door in a run. As soon as they got into range, Jones ordered their surrender. The men made ready for battle, but Jones shot Todd Hall first in the shoulder and knocked him down. He got back on his feet and staggered toward the fort. His sister Nell grabbed him and pulled him into the fort by the back door. Shots rang out of the fort for quite a while. In the middle of the battle, Todd Hall's wife came out of the fort onto the porch, climbed onto a fence, and exclaimed, quote, "Hurrah for old Claib Jones! Kill all of them, and that damn Saylers woman too," unquote. Jones called back to her saying that it was what he was intending to do. The fight continued, but the ammo that the Vance Jones side was using would not penetrate the logs of the fort. Mac Hall was with Jones and his side, and he was wounded and died a few days later. Hall and his men slipped out and left the fort that night. The next day, on Jack's Creek in Floyd County, Hall and his men waylaid and killed Abner Little, who was the constable who was with Jones at the attack of Fort Bates. Hall and his men fled for Fort Wright on Elkhorn. Jones and 3 of his men went to Cincinnati to buy 37 Winchesters and returned to Knott County. Upon their return, the jailer of Knott County, Isom Sloan, and Deputy Letcher County Dolph Drawn swore out warrants on Claib Jones, Dick Vance, and the rest of their party for wounding Todd Hall and others in the shootout. The men gave their bond to get out of jail. The governor of the state of Kentucky offered a reward of $500 for the capture and arrest of Todd Hall and each of his men. Jones was appointed as special bailiff to arrest them. John Wright sends a message. The news of the shootout did not sit very well with John Wright. Since Todd Hall was a friend and under his protection in Letcher County, he would do all he could to protect him. So he sent a message to Claib Jones stating that the good citizens of Letcher County would shoot and kill Jones and his men on sight. So, to test this out to see if it was true, Jones went to Letcher County. He found that this was not true at all of the people there, and they were friends to the law and order, and were friendly to Jones and his men. There did not seem to be any hostility in the area whatsoever toward anyone who was coming to arrest Hall and his men. During this time, it was discovered that Todd Hall had left his men behind and traveled to Virginia. After this video, please see our video on Todd Hall for his version of events on how he escaped and went to Virginia and ended up in jail for the murder of Police Chief Enos Hilton. Trips to the fort. Jones and his men made several trips back and forth to Fort Wright. However, they never found anyone there or guarding the fort. They made several raids on the fort, resting a while and then going back to do another raid. Precautions were taken each time Jones, Vance, and his men got within 12 miles of the fort. The men would take 2 days to travel to the fort, each time being sure to travel only during the night and resting during the day. When they would come to a road, they would lay stones across the road to walk upon, with the last man taking up the stones as he went, throwing them to the side of the road so that no sign would ever be left to the crossings. When they came to Elkhorn Creek, they traveled 5 miles by the waterway, and when they reached near the fort, they would climb up a rocky branch and came around the hillside to as close to the fort as they could without being discovered. Shootout at Fort Wright. After breakfast, a woman was spotted riding up and down the road, looking for signs of a possible invasion. She would go up each road and dismount, look around, mount her horse, and ride in the other direction, dismount, and return to the house after a few minutes. Upon her return, several men ran out of the fort carrying their guns. Jones ordered the surrender. The gunfight then began. Wright and his men ran a running fight all the way to the Cumberland Mountain. Wright had a beach-loading gun and peppered buckshots all around Jones and his men. While the running fight was going on, Nell Bates, Hall's sister, was at the fort and screaming, quote, "Oh, Claib Jones is back and trying to kill my people," unquote. After Wright had made his escape, his wife fixed Jones and his men breakfast when they returned to the fort. She was of friendly conversation and always spoke the truth. 5 or 6 of Wright's other women came to the fort to see if anyone had been killed or wounded, and looked on Jones and his men as if they were the devil incarnate. After searching the fort, Jones and his men went on to the second story of the building and found Miles Bates and Blackhawk Sizemore and Bill D. Hall, who was the brother of Todd Hall. Jones and his men took these prisoners and headed toward Prestonsburg with them. Trouble withdrawn. On the way to Prestonsburg, the men stopped for the night in Hyman, Kentucky. Deputy Dolph Drawn had made a posse of men on his own and had made a raid on Fort Wright. This was not successful, and upon their return trip, Drawn and his men were waylaid in an ambush by Wright and his men, and a gunfight ensued. One of Drawn's men had been killed, and the horse that Drawn was riding on was shot out from under him. Drawn was mad about this and wanted to kill the prisoners of Jones for revenge. Jones refused to allow this to happen. Jones told Drawn that if he wanted to kill men, then he needed to go capture his own to do it with. Drawn gave orders for his men to line up to shoot the prisoners. Jones and his men got in front of the prisoners and drew their guns. Drawn saw that it was going to be a fight and withdrew his men and left. Thus, on this trip, Fort Wright was broken up and John Wright and his men fled to Virginia. Prestonsburg Jail. The next day the party made it to Prestonsburg and the prisoners were put into jail. The jailer, Jim Lane, was afraid that Wright would come and do the jailbreak, releasing the prisoners. Jones went to the court and got permission to have an extra man guard the prisoners. Cicero Cox was chosen by Jones as the guard. There was a large reward offered for Todd Hall, George Johnson, and others, but there was no reward for John Wright. After some time, John Wright brought in all the other men from the Todd Hall gang, except for Todd Hall, Wash Craft, and George Johnson. Craft had left the area. George Johnson was found shot to death in the woods by someone he considered to be a friend. John Wright got the reward for all of the men that he turned in. The only man wounded at Fort Wright was Bill Bates, who was shot in the back with a Winchester bullet that had went through a fence post first and then embedded itself under his skin. Claib runs for jailer. Claib Jones went to Hyman, Kentucky for a time. Isom Sloan, the Prestonsburg jailer, had resigned his post, and Jones was appointed in his place as the county had 1 year until its election for its officers. Jones didn't feel that he had a chance to run for the office, as the Republican base was not very large in Knott County. There were only 84 people registered to vote on that ticket in Knott County. Word got out that Rebel Captain Ance Hayes was running for the office, so Jones felt that he would give him an opponent in the race because they were both against each other in the Civil War. Hayes ran on the Democratic ticket and Jones on the Republican ticket. Jones won the election by 184 majority vote. This didn't sit well with Captain, and he swore that he would run Jones out of the county for the slight. War between Hayes and Jones. Jones was pretty confident since he had licked Hayes in many Civil War battles. He felt that he could pretty well handle him during this part of their conflict with each other. So, instead of leaving Knott County, Jones forced Hayes to leave instead. Hayes and his men would come into the county from time to spy on Jones and to see what he was up to. Jones says that he could tell when one of them was in town by the way Sarah Duke's dog would bark. One day, while Jones was driving in his cattle for the night, several men from the Hayes faction hid in the bushes. They shot 6 rounds at Jones. He fell to the ground as if he was dead. He calls the men cowards because they did not come to check on him to see if he was dead or not. He said that not a bullet hit him because they were poor marksmen, but they left him laying on the ground. As soon as Jones knew that they had left, he got up and he finished driving home his cattle. But this wasn't over yet. He also claims that they had shot at him several times over the next little while trying to kill him. Finally, Jones had enough of that, and he went to the jail and summoned several men to help guard the jail. Hayes went and got warrants out for Jones and his men for banding and gave them to the sheriff for their arrests. Jones also had warrants out for Hayes and his factions for shooting at him and trying to kill him. Jones finally summoned some of the men to go with him, and they took to the brush to hunt the Hayes faction and arrest them. It was uncertain on how long both factions were in the brush before Claib finally came back into town and made his headquarters in the jail. That same night, the Hall faction came into town and took up their headquarters in the old drawn fort across the street. Jones sent a message inviting the group to come to the jail for supper free of charge and on him. They sent a message back to Jones stating that they thanked him very kindly for the offer, but they had already eaten. Jones sent a message back telling them to surrender as he had warrants out for their arrest, and they sent a message back saying that they refused to surrender. The shots then began ringing out in the town's mountain air that night from both sides. After a while, Jones' men were able to drive the Hayes faction from the upper floor of their fort to the underfloor. Claib Jones had noticed the front door was ajar and took a shot. The shot went past Lewis Hayes, who was standing at the fireplace, struck a rock, bounced back, and struck Hayes in the stomach. Hayes sent word to Jones that he was shot and wanted to go home and die. It was only afterwards that it was discovered that Hayes only wanted to go home and change his clothes. A few days later, officers tried to capture and arrest the Hayes faction. In the attempt, John Sloan was killed and Andy Sloan was wounded. It was not long after this that the sheriff sent word that he would send the Hayes faction back to Buckhorn and that he would destroy the warrants that they had against Jones. In return, he requested that Jones destroy the warrants that he had against the Hayes faction. After the fight, Jones went down to the old drawn fort and took 3 brass kettles that belonged to Aunt Rachel Hayes. Miss Hayes came to Jones looking for the pots. Jones told her that he had captured the pots and that they were now his. He did send the pots back to her after a short time, though. And that was the end of the Jones-Hayes feud. Jailbreak and the Vance Bates feud. Law and order was restored to Knott County and everything resumed its normal course. Several outlaws were captured, arrested, tried, and convicted and sent to the pen in Frankfort, Kentucky. While they were in the court system, it was Jones' duty to watch over them, and Jones claims that he had a great bunch of guards working for him. One night, several men made a raid for a jailbreak and release of the prisoners. They used a sledgehammer to try to break through the door. The guards caught them and a shootout began. Miles Vance, brother to Dick Vance, was killed in the shootings, but no one was able to escape the jail and the raiders were forced away. The Vance and Bates families, who were also allies with Jones during the Jones-Hall-Wright feud, soon began to fight against each other. Several men were killed on both sides. Peace only came to the county when the posse was formed and forced both sides to back down. Peace was once again restored to Knott County. The French and Eversole War. While Claib was still serving as jailer in Knott County, the French and Eversole War broke out in Perry County. The war broke out between lawyers who were wealthy and influential men. On one side was B. F. French, and on the other side was Joseph Eversole. 50 men, including Joseph Eversole, the leader of one faction, was killed in the conflict. We will get into this war in our Appalachian Feud series, but for now we will return to the Claib Jones part of this war. Claib states that he went to Perry County to survey the situation. He then accompanied several citizens who went to Frankfort, Kentucky to secure an order for 50 soldiers to help restore peace. The soldiers went to Perry County and captured the leaders together with their men. After a change of venue for the trial was made to Clark and Fayette counties, and several attempts were made to bring the different factions to trial, a general amnesty was granted and everyone was liberated. And thus ended Claib Jones' part in the war. The death of James Claiborne Jones. Claib Jones does not state what he was doing for the next 20 years of his life, other than he had joined a church and he felt that his soul was cleared of all that he had done before then. Throughout his sordid life he had never once been shot, although he had been stabbed and or beaten on several occasions. More than 100 men would die in his encounters. He would die in his old age a very content man. Claib Jones would die in Warren, Knott County, Kentucky, on November 27, 1914. He would be laid to rest in a private cemetery in Hazard, Kentucky by D. Y. Combs, one of the wealthiest men in Perry County. Combs would state that Jones saved the life of his father when he was captured and court-martialed by Jones's men. They attempted to kill him and Jones put a stop to it. The Combs family was very thankful for this action, and so he had a place of honor among the Combs family. His funeral was attended by a large number of people. This ends our look at the autobiography of Claib Jones. We hope that you have enjoyed our look at his life as he retold it. A special thank you. We wish again to thank those who have helped us gather information about the people in this series. We at Kentucky Tennessee Living could not do the amount of research and storytelling that we do without the help of some great historians and friends. We have a special list today of people that we wish to thank. A special thank you goes out to Anthony Blair and Vicki McPeaks Tackett. Another very special thank you goes to Charlotte Hicks Cottle for her help about the Jones family. Thank you. We at Kentucky Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video series on the Appalachian Outlaws. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell notifications button. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries of Appalachian history.